welcome everyone to a new edition of the Geo Interview, where we engage with experts on some of the world's most pressing challenges. The war on Ukraine has now entered its third year, and the stakes have never been higher than before. While the battlefield remains intense, the diplomatic front is just as critical. United States and Russian officials are holding high-stake meetings without Ukraine representation at the table, raising urgent questions about who truly gets to speak about the country's future. European nations are calling for Russia's immediate withdrawal, while reports suggest that US is negotiating access to Ukraine's rare mineral reserves in exchange for the continued war support. The paths to peace seem more complex than ever before. As the country continues to navigate through war, diplomacy, and reconstruction, there are so many questions about peace that has come up. We want to explore what a just and lasting resolution would look like. How do we even get there? What are the obstacles that come in the way? And what role does the international community has to play? To help us navigate through these complex questions, today we have with us an exceptional panel of experts with deep knowledge in international relations, conflict resolution, and policy analysis. First of all, we have Dr. Luke Cooper, Associate Professorial Research Fellow at the London School of Economics and Director of Peace Reps Ukraine Program. Joining us from Odessa is Dr. Volodymyr Dobovic, Associate Professor at the Department of International Relations and Director of the Center for International Studies. We also have with us Dr. Marina Rabinovich, Assistant Professor at the Department of Public Policy and Governance at the Kyiv School of Economics. And finally, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Leon Hartwell, Senior Associate at LSE Ideas and Non-Resident Senior Fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. I would like to welcome all the panel members today. Thanks everyone for being here today. Let's dive right into the questions now. My first question would be directed to Dr. Luke Cooper. Dr. Luke, economic models play a vital role in shaping a country's resilience, particularly in times of wars. In the context of the ongoing conflict, I would like to understand what are the potential benefits and challenges of implementing a state-led economic model for Ukraine? How would it look like? Over to you.
Well, one answer to that question is it would look a lot like what Ukraine has at the moment. So, I mean, since over the last 3 years, Ukraine has developed, in a way, a state-led war economy. One can question whether this was by contingency, by accident, or the extent to which it was by design. But what has broadly happened is that Ukraine has put enormous amounts of its domestic economic resources into its military-industrial complex and into its armed forces. The effect of that is that it's had a knock-on effect on the rest of the economy that has then readjusted to wartime conditions. This is really important in a war situation for the state to play this kind of role of supporting the rest of the economy for perhaps obvious reasons. Markets often break down in war conditions. They are less resilient. There's less investment because of the insecurity that wars inevitably create to property. It has to be said in that context, though, Ukraine has what you could call a hybrid war economy. It's not as state centralized as classic examples that we might look to in World War II. It doesn't make use of central planning, for example. And you would have to say that markets are perhaps surprisingly resilient in Ukraine at the moment. I was in Dnipro in October, for example, where apartment blocks are still going up to house the workers that the city needs for its industrial economy, and that investment is only being indirectly supported by the state, not directly supported by the state. So markets are actually still functioning in Ukraine to a degree at the same time, but it's certainly a state-led war economy.
Thank you for your views. This is really interesting to understand the political economy of Ukraine and the important aspect that you have highlighted, that economy is still showing signs of resilience even during these tough times. And that's something that is really interesting to note, especially if we understand the political economy of war-torn countries. My next question is related to international alliances, and I would like to ask this question to someone who has an extensive experience in terms of relationship between United States and Ukraine. Dr. Waldemir Dobovik, my question to you is, how do you understand the current state of partnership between United States and Ukraine? What do you think are some of the strategic measures that can be adopted by both these nations to strengthen their alliance? And how can these efforts influence the broader security dynamics, if I may ask you?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, U.S.-Ukraine relations, something which plays a huge role for us in Ukraine, especially now in this last 3 years of full-scale invasion of Russia against Ukraine. Clearly, there's been a major change, the watershed change of power in U.S., and we are seeing already in the last few days the new approach by this administration, Donald Trump administration, which is not making us really happy in Ukraine. There are some people still hoping in Ukraine that maybe somehow, eventually, gradually, the Trump's presidency will turn out for better for Ukraine. But I personally do not belong to those. I actually didn't have any optimistic expectations from Trump returning to the White House. So therefore, of course, when we're seeing the change of attitude, the tone from Washington, we're not really pleased because U.S. positioned itself for a good reason to be an ally for Ukraine and being invested in Ukraine's victory, or at least not loss in this war. But as of recent, U.S. is pretending to be some kind of a honest broker or some mediator instead. So we don't even hear who is an aggressor and who is not. The recent couple of examples of how U.S. diplomats now interfered with text of resolution in the United Nations General Assembly and also G7, the Great Seven, a resolution now dedicated to the third anniversary of the full-scale war of Russia against Ukraine. And it's very disappointing and really disappointing to us in Ukraine that Americans insist now that this is called a conflict, not a war. It's called Russia-Ukraine. No one is calling Russia an aggressor. No one is actually saying that the need is to support Ukraine. There is also pressure for Ukraine to sign some kind of a deal that some natural resources will be used by the United States in some way. Incredible pressure, actually, which is quite unusual, unexpected for us, which really reminds us of some kind of old school imperialistic neo-colonialist kind of activities when you say, well, we gave you some money, and while we gave you some money, we didn't say you have to pay back, but now we kind of think you probably have to pay back, and how you do not going to do that? You'll probably give us half of your rare earth minerals away, which is, by the way, even in the most modest estimates, is maybe 10 times at least more than what U.S. gave to Ukraine in the previous 3 years. So therefore, right now is a very risky, rough period of time when Ukraine still wants to see if there is a path to peace. Can it be fair, that peace? Can it be durable? Can we actually receive some security guarantees that would prevent Russia from continuing with aggression or maybe start a new war in 2, 3, 5 years from now? And unfortunately, U.S. is not as reliable a partner as it was in the previous 3 years before Trump coming to the White House. But we'll see. I mean, of course, with President Trump, you can also always have some surprises. So we'll see where it goes. And it's very important then for others, European partners of Ukraine, to support Ukraine now even more when U.S. is kind of turning its back on Ukraine, it seems. Thank you.
Really interesting points you have mentioned here. I would also like to acknowledge the fact that you have so brilliantly mentioned about how narratives can be set during war, how something can be called a conflict and not a war, something so heinous can be downplayed by certain media diplomacy. This also brings our focus to something that was being introduced in the introduction before about mineral resources being a vital tool of diplomacy during wartime and how these things also come into play. I would like to redirect everyone's focus towards something more domestic, something more local. I would like to ask the next question to Professor Marina. Professor Marina, my question is related to local governance. In the context of Ukraine's ongoing decentralization reforms, what are some of the primary challenges in enhancing the resilience of local municipalities and local government bodies? How can these challenges be overcome to ensure that there is effective governance and sustainable development at the local level as well? Because at the end of the day, people are, accessing those resources straight from the local government, and they have the most impact.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say that at least when it comes to administrative part of it, decentralization is more or less over. So there are no shifting borders between communities now. However, what can always be done is to further increase their capacity, and this is what the EU has been doing a lot. They have been having for quite a long time the EU-LEAD project, which aimed particularly to bring public services very low to the citizens so that they don't have to travel much and can receive all possible services at their communities. Also, they trained a lot the people who work there in different aspects when it comes to public services, when it comes to cooperation, writing EU projects and similar things. And this is a process which is kind of forever. You can always invent new forms of knowledge which would be useful for communities. This is one thing. And another thing which is obviously very important are the residents. And since many people lost their homes in Ukraine, it's pretty important to invest into building new homes for them and invest into sustainable programs which would allow people who don't have a place to live to acquire these new homes. So also in a way that they trust these programs and also come from abroad back to Ukraine in order to live in these communities. Even though you cannot do it equally because some communities are close to the front line and people would be reluctant to come back there, but at least there are quite many areas in central and western, central northern Ukraine which can be still subject to such programs.
Thank you, Doctor. Such an important analysis, and the fact that in terms of post-war reconstruction efforts, we also have to take into consideration the geography of these municipalities and which areas are more affected, and how do we think of sustainability and provision of basic services. That's really insightful. Thank you for that. My next question is for Dr. Leon Hartwell. Dr. Leon, you have a great experience in terms of understanding mediation efforts, international mediation. I want to understand, in the context of the Russian war on Ukraine, how can international mediation efforts be structured to effectively address the underlying causes of this and to facilitate a sustainable resolution? Are there any lessons from past resolution or mediation attempts that you can highlight for us?
Manisha, thank you so much for having me, and I'm deeply honored to be part of this panel discussion, especially at this very crucial moment for Ukraine, especially. I think given that India aspires to be a global leader and a voice for the global South, it's only appropriate that that you have this discussion and that this discussion matters. This war outcome, the outcome of this war will influence India's position in the world. And I think that while India and Ukraine have very distinct historical trajectories, you both share deep-rooted experiences of colonial rule, of resistance, and the struggle for sovereignty. India has also consistently supported sovereignty and territorial integrity in global forums, and I'm convinced that a Russian victory would set a very dangerous precedent, that powerful states can annex weaker neighbors, which could also embolden China in South Asia. So thank you for holding this discussion. To answer your question, I think while a mediated agreement is possible, an agreement under current conditions will not resolve the core issues fueling the war. I think a sustainable peace deal will fail because, one, there is no hurting stalemate. Both parties are still willing to continue the war. Secondly, I think that there's a clash in terms of visions of peace. Russia demands control over occupied and partially occupied territories, including Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. Ukraine's position, on the other hand, is that it wants to restore full territorial integrity. If Zelensky makes a deal under current conditions and where he gives away all these territories to Russia, he will not be able to go back to Ukraine and sell this deal because the Ukrainian public will be against it. Thirdly, the issue of security concerns, I think, is non-negotiable. Right now, Russia's stance is that Ukraine cannot be part of NATO. It should not get NATO membership, but it also wants to impose other restrictions that Ukraine, for example, has to have limits on on its troops and all that, which would constrain Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Ukraine's position, on the other hand, is that it wants to be a NATO member and it needs to have strong security guarantees. So I don't think, given the conflicting positions on those issues, that you will have a viable agreement at present. I think Ukraine is still scarred by past betrayal. So when we're talking about lessons of past negotiation efforts, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons under the Budapest Memorandum, where Russia promised to respect Ukraine's territory, not only respect, but defend it, Ukraine's territory and its sovereignty. So, if there are any lessons about the past, is that nothing is guaranteed when it comes to Russia with regards to any agreement. This war is an existential war for Ukraine. The stakes are too high for any compromises on the above issues. And it's not just about territory, I should say. If the war was only about territory or resources, it would be relatively easy to kind of divvy up some of those issues, but it's not. It's an existential war, as I mentioned. And the data supports what I'm saying, that conflicts centered on security and national identity rarely end in any durable negotiated settlements. So that's my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hartwell. That was such a compelling analysis, and there are so many layers that you have unfolded for us. The fact that, as you said, the war is now has reached a state where it's about existential issues, and it has it's more complicated than ever. Moving forward, my next question is once again directed to Dr. Luke Cooper. Dr. Cooper, war often necessitates rapid economic decisions. However, their long-term consequences can also be really profound. My question to you is, how does economic liberalization and deregulation during wartime can affect the social cohesion and overall war effort in Ukraine? Are there economic models or historical precedents that can be explored in terms of understanding societal mobilization and stabilization efforts during conflicts like these in countries like Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you, Manisha. That's a terrific question. I think if we're looking for some of the reasons why Ukraine has had the successful resistance that it's had to a much larger enemy, I think we have to look at the strength of social bonds inside the country, the dense civic networks that arose out of the Revolution of Dignity in 2014 and created this very strong self-help culture inside the society. You see illustrations of this everywhere inside Ukraine, fundraising for armed forces personnel. The steel factory I went to in Dnipro back in October was running regular visits to the front line of humanitarian aid through volunteer networks. You see it overseas in Poland with the mobilization of humanitarian and aid resources through often very informal networks stretching across Ukraine. So that has created a kind of public good around the war effort, which I think has been extremely important as a sort of immaterial factor, if one wants to put it that way, in supporting the Ukrainian war effort, in generating commitment inside society for the war effort. Clearly, though, there have always been debates within that context. I mean, if you talk to organized labor inside Ukraine. If you talk to the trade union movement, they will tend to argue that they have quite a difficult relationship with the government. But I should caveat that. I mean, they also overwhelmingly support the war effort, and they will be the first to say that to you. The further caveat is that as a result of the Ukrainian constitution, the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian trade unions have a lot of institutional structures where they talk to each other all the time. So that kind of social partnership policy is actually built into the constitution of the Ukrainian state. And where the tension lies is more in the vision for what Ukraine looks like after the war. And there, I think that that's quite a kind of interesting suspended question, if you like, because if you say to anyone in Ukraine, they will argue, well, we need to build back better. But then the definition of what building back better is really very different. So it could be from a very, very low tax, almost economic libertarian, if you like, agenda, free market agenda, to something that looks more like, on the one hand, to, on the other hand, something that looks more like a highly regulated Western European social partnership economy. So I think amongst those that are participating in that debate inside Ukraine, there's a kind of informal agreement that this is a political argument we will have once we deal with the Russians and we've liberated our country. And of course, I think for those of us who are outside of Ukraine, we need to support that democratic position, that fight for freedom, but also that institutional basis that it's up to Ukrainians to decide what their country looks like, what the definition of Build Back Better looks like after the war.
For your views. This is really interesting, and the fact that you have mentioned the role of institutionalism and the inculcation of democratic values, and how the way institutions and these non-state actors or state actors interact can also affect social cohesion during wars, and how people understand war and whether they want to fight for the nation or whether who they want to support. I feel that's a very nuanced way to looking at it. My next question is related to the Black Sea region, a very critical geopolitical hotspot over the years. Dr. Walter Mir-Dobovic, in the light of your expertise in the Black Sea region, what are the primary challenges that you can see in this region? And how do you evaluate the roles of regional actors and external powers in addressing these security concerns? Do you think there are any kind of collaborative strategies that can be implemented in order to ensure more stability?
Yeah. Well, before I answer the question, just very quick comment on your previous remark about the democracy and the state of democracy. And I think in Ukraine, it's very important for us to maintain democracy. I mean, right now, we do have some signs of democracy being suspended because, of course, there is this major war and there is martial law. The other day, President Trump was looking surprised that Ukraine has a martial law. Of course, you do have a martial law in a country which has such an existential challenge and a threat on its hands. So, but at the same time, no one is planning to do away with democracy. And President Zelensky has ratings measured and actually going down, but of course not to 4%, as again was mentioned by Trump the other day. And Ukrainians cherish democracy. We like it. That to us, it's one of the things why we're fighting against Russia, because Russia is a authoritarian, increasingly authoritarian country. Ukraine is a democracy, maybe not a perfect one, but we like it to be that way. And therefore, so the martial law will be lifted one day. There will be elections. There is a position in Ukraine, in the parliament for the duration of the time being of the war. This opposition is not necessarily very critical of Zelensky because he's a wartime leader of Ukraine, but they can be, and they are critical sometimes from time to time about him. So, I mean, the point is that Ukraine, of course, is not a dictatorship. Ukraine is still vibrant as much as you can have a vibrant democracy under such circumstances. When it comes to the Black Sea region, well, of course, everything depends on how the war ends and when does it end. Because, of course, the Black Sea is one of the areas where you have the war ongoing. You did have Ukrainian ports being blocked for like half a year early in the full-scale war, so between February and July of 22. Then there had been deblocked. There was a grain trade deal negotiated by Turkey and United Nations. Then Russia was part of it. Then they left the grain deal. But anyhow, Ukraine is managing now to transport and carry a lot of agricultural products to the rest of the world, and actually playing the major role, because we found out ourselves in Ukraine how much of the segment of the market actually belongs to Ukraine when we've been blocked and there was a blockade of Ukraine ports. Suddenly people were not receiving enough sunflower oil or bread all over the world, including, I remember clearly reports about shortages of bread in Sri Lanka, for instance. So basically it's a problem, and there was a food crisis around the globe, the global food crisis, but luckily enough, now Ukraine is almost back to the same level of exporting agricultural products as was before the war, and Russia can hardly do something about it. I mean, of course, they can destroy the port facilities, but they cannot get close to the coast, because, of course, Ukraine can actually strike their ships. And moreover, of course, most of the Russian Black Sea Navy assets been moved from Sevastopol in occupied Crimea to Novorossiysk and other places further away from Ukraine, so that they cannot be reached by Ukrainian drones and Ukrainian missiles. And in general, of course, there is a tension, there is anxiety in the region, there is a lack of security in the region. There is no idea how you can put together the collective security project in place while this war is ongoing. Everyone is positioning themselves in a certain way. Clearly, Romania and Bulgaria are kind of on the side of Ukraine in many ways, being members of EU and NATO. Turkey is balancing its game. They're maintaining relations with both Russia and Ukraine. Georgia, surprisingly and disappointingly for us, the Georgian government is not necessarily supporting Ukraine, even though Georgia and Ukraine were allies in the region for a long time. But the Georgian society actually is still very supportive of Ukraine. So everyone is balancing. Like if you talk about Azerbaijan and Armenia, they also have their own interest in the light of what's going on in the region. But it's just too early to say what's going to happen to the region and regional security, because first we need to know how the war will end, and will it end soon, or will it end later in a day.
Really interesting how you have unpacked the phenomena of globalization in this, and how countries are so interconnected. The fact
Indeed.
the fact that agriculture in Ukraine is not important only for Ukraine, but for the whole world. And so many countries are dependent on Ukraine, and so many countries are relying on it. And that's really important. My next question is a bit similar to the external relations that I have been talking about. This is directed to Professor Marina Rabinovich. My question to you is about the European Union's external relations. How can EU's trade and development policies be optimized to support political development and rule of law in neighboring countries? Do you think it still has the power? Do you think it still has a big role to play?
Definitely, it still has the power, because Ukraine got the EU candidate status, and it additionally the same increased the EU's leverage in Ukraine after the war started. Plus, if you think of EU assistance and the fact that we basically don't have any other regional integration options anymore, because learned quite much about what integration with Russia could look like. That's why there is not much choice than implementing what the EU asks for, and therefore the EU has an opportunity to, let's say, use association agreement and deepen comprehensive free trade area further to support political reform in Ukraine. However, at the same time, it's important for the EU, not just in Ukraine, but broadly, if we come back to the discussion that was held previously about the US, it's important for the EU also to be able to think strategically and geopolitically, and think how it can, let's say, rebuild its trade agreements the way that the EU is more strategically independent, the way that the EU knows about its dependencies, for example, with the US, but at the same time can compensate them, at least to some extent, with new contacts and new trade arrangements with other countries. So the EU already learned one painful lesson with the energy trade with Russia and had to switch rather quickly, which is still quite painful. And they sometimes still come to the legacy of Nord Stream ideas, especially if you think of the opposition parties in Germany amidst the upcoming elections. Still, the cheap energy resources is something they really want, but they managed to overcome this problem, at least partially, by diversifying trade, by making new arrangements like with Azerbaijan, with Qatar, with other countries, and this is what the EU should also look like. So it's definitely important to promote political reform, but now for the EU it needs to make its trade policy more suited to geopolitical needs also. Yeah.
That's really nuanced, and that's really impressive how you have mentioned how it's not just about political reforms anymore, it's also about trade policies. And the fact that you mentioned about the problem of dependency, about these multilateral organizations, these multi-groupings, through some countries, and how, we have to like maneuver through these challenges. My next question is directed to Dr. Leon Hartwell. Dr. Leon, in our previous discussion, different panelists have talked about the role played by political leaders like President Donald Trump and America. I want to understand that in the present context where President Donald Trump has suggested a mediated solution to the Russia-Ukraine war, what insights can we draw into his mediation style based on the past diplomatic engagements? And do you think that if he were to act as a mediator, what approaches or potential outcomes can we anticipate through that?
Thank you for that question, Manisha. Yes, in terms of Trump priority is Trump. His mediation would be about his personal legacy and about showmanship, not about sustainable peace. Trump presents himself as sort of the master negotiator. He's asserted, for example, that he would end this Russia-Ukraine war within 24 hours of assuming office, and yet here we are. And here I need to be clear also, like, as I mentioned, I don't think the conditions are right for any form of mediated solution that would lead to any sort of outcome. But still, I think Trump as a mediator would also be a disaster at the same time. What we've seen, as mentioned by Voldemar earlier, over the last month since Trump has taken office, is sort of this pro-Russia pivot. Trump administration officials sort of are now floating the idea that Ukraine should cede occupied territories to Russia. We're also increasingly hearing that they're opposed to Ukraine's NATO membership, which is really important for Ukraine. And then Trump is echoing Kremlin narratives, like blaming Ukraine for starting this war. He's also claimed that Zelensky is a dictator and things like that. And that really plays into Kremlin sort of propaganda. We also heard earlier during this panel discussion that Trump is sort of exhorting Ukraine in certain ways. US support for Ukraine is now linked to access to Ukraine's rare earths, at a time when Ukraine is in an extremely vulnerable position. And I think, just going back to some of the issues that I mentioned on sort of the Russia pivot, Trump is giving away a lot of issues that should be talked around the negotiation table prior to any form of mediation process. So that is really problematic. In terms of Trump's track record in diplomacy and mediation, the situation that I observed most closely during the Trump 1 administration was the sort of, I think it was 2020, the Serbia-Kosovo mediation process that took place at the White House. It was extremely superficial. And I wrote an article at the time, Diplomacy is Not the Apprentice. I think both, Trump tried to present that mediation process as sort of the deal of the century, but, Serbia and Kosovo signed two different documents. And I'm not talking about their signatures on two different documents. The language in the documents were different. Those documents were never ratified by their parliaments, which means that there was actually no deal. And yet Trump claimed that, it was the deal of the century, as I mentioned. He claimed that, quote unquote, I stopped mass killing, and he sort of demanded a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. So that said, I think if Trump were to mediate this, sort of between Russia and Ukraine, I think he's going to put a lot of pressure on Ukraine to give in to territorial concessions. He's going to focus on a quick optics-driven deal rather than a sustainable long-term resolution that would help to end this war for good. And I think such a deal would risk legitimizing Russia's territorial gains, which will have massive negative implications at the global level, not just for Ukraine, but also for the world. Thank you.
It's so interesting how you have mentioned the role of narratives once again, something that we discussed earlier, and the cherry picking of issues by political leaders and the way they package deals and the way they set those certain aspects of the deal where they extract the most out of it rather than doing the good. But yeah, that's really interesting to look at and something to think about. Now I would redirect our focus again to Dr. Luke Cooper. Dr. Luke, while going through your profile and reading your works, I came across this concept called new global fragmentation. Considering the hypothesis of new global fragmentation arising from Russia's war against Ukraine, how does this concept differ from traditional geopolitical analysis? Please share, what does it mean? How do we explain this one? And what are the implications of this fragmentation on international support mechanism and Ukraine's defense of its sovereignty?
Yeah, so I think the concept of geopolitical fragmentation is trying to capture the way that the number of actors that have a significant stake in the international order has multiplied to a great deal. Now, if you were serious about resolving the Russia-Ukrainian war through negotiation, I think any peace agreement process that you one would design would reflect that. And that would make it probably the most complex peace negotiation in history. You would need India around the table in some form, and other global South actors, Brazil, that have, and you'd need, I think, Asian states involved beyond, including, of course, China. And what is interesting in that context about the way in which Trump is approaching how to end the war is that you can describe it as encapsulating what we might call great power politics. So this is the idea that two great powers, in this case the United States and Russia, need to meet in a series of smoke-filled rooms, decide the outcome, and impose that outcome on the rest of the world. Now, my hypothesis, my conceptual hypothesis, which I admit Trump is testing, would be that it's not possible in the 21st century for geopolitics to be undertaken in the way that Trump and Putin imagine it. I don't think that they have the power capacities to impose an agreement on Ukraine and indeed on Europe and indeed on the wider global South. I think it's very interesting from Russia's geopolitical relationship with the relationships with the outside world that China is, of course, this has been overlooked, but China was also sidelined from the Saudi meeting and pushed to one side, even though you can criticize it, but they have come forward with proposals to end the Russo-Ukrainian war. So Trump is coming in with this classic kind of neo-colonial politics that the mineral deal, of course, is a part of. The question is, does he have the material capacity to impose an outcome on Ukraine and other states? I think broadly that he doesn't. But there are three areas that are really tricky for the Ukrainians and Europeans to make up for. Those areas, I think, first of all, are Patriot missile defense systems, which are the gold standard. They can knock out all of the Russian missiles, and only the US has access to those. Secondly, it's kit for American military infrastructure that Ukraine already has, so spare parts. Again, you need the Americans to supply those. Those two things can be purchased in principle from the Trump administration by Ukraine and its allies, so that might be possible. But then the third thing, that if Trump really wanted to try to impose an outcome on Ukraine, I think is harder, and that's the quality of American intelligence. And if you talk to the Ukrainians, those are the three things that they're really concerned about. And if Trump really wanted to play hardball with the Ukrainians, he would probably say, well, look, we're going to cut off your access to US intelligence sources. And I think that would be troubling for the Ukrainian side. It would be really difficult for the Europeans to make up for that. The final thing I would emphasize in all of that context is that this is a very strange and perhaps unique situation, because the head of the US government has come along and appeared to endorse Russia's position, appeared to align itself with Russia's war aims. However, the entire institutional structure of the American security apparatus is still embedded in Euro-Atlantic security institutions, and in the Ukrainian side, there's still military aid from the US flowing in to Ukraine right now. So it's a very contradictory picture, and I'm just emphasizing that because I think it creates enormous uncertainty, because we're in extremely uncertain and previously untraveled waters when it comes to US foreign policy right now.
Thanks for that. I would just like to emphasize the fact that when we're doing political analysis, it's very easy to say these are wicked problems, but then contextualizing those is something that's a skill. And I really appreciate the fact that you have contextualized why it's complicated. What are the areas of most important, stress points between Ukraine and US, and why there is power imbalance in a certain way. Thanks for sharing that. My next question is directed to Dr. Waldemir Tabovic. Dr. Waldemir, I would like to understand your view on Ukraine's foreign policy. How has the nation's approach evolved during the times of crisis? What are the key priorities that Ukraine should focus now in order to navigate its international relationships and to balance its domestic interest with the external pressures that it is facing right now?
Well, I mean, the priorities are obvious. We need to survive first as a state. This is an existential struggle. This is some kind of war, which many people call war for independence, because we didn't have one when Soviet Union broke up, and then Ukraine, among other countries, emerged as independent nation states. So first, we need to secure that there is Ukraine, sovereign Ukraine, independent Ukraine, even if temporarily there will be some territories lost. But then think about those territories that are currently under control of Ukrainian government and Ukrainian troops, which is most of it, 4/5 of Ukrainian territory, about 80% of Ukrainian territory. So the foreign policy then plays a secondary role in terms of helping to defend the country. So whatever we need to do to secure better deals in the security field, that's what the foreign policy is all about. So therefore, we need the foreign policy diplomacy, which is helping us on international level, including United Nations, where you're going to have a meeting on Monday, an important one. And it's been quite important still for us, even though UN is kind of paralyzed by, of course, Russia's and China's veto power on the Security Council, but still, as a forum, as a place where you can meet and discuss, and Ukraine has been supported in a number of votes in the last 3 years, so it's still important for us. So here is a role for Ukraine's diplomacy and foreign policies, and we need to secure continuous supply of weapons, because it's all about weapons. Unfortunately, whether we like it or not. Before you get to some kind of peace agreement, you need to have a better negotiating position, and that depends on situation and battleground. So why is Russia now so confident and bold, and why they feel that they can continue the war? Because it's going their way. They have an initiative. They're crawling slowly into Ukraine's territory, even though, as was mentioned again, now that, of course, people who are saying that Ukraine is about to lose dramatically like any day now, that's not true, because at the pace that Russia is having within Ukraine, it would take them almost a century, another 80 or 90 years, to continue pushing before they would actually be able to control Ukraine, most of Ukraine. But that's not going to be the case. But yeah, we need weapons, and therefore foreign policy, we need security guarantees. Ukraine has signed security assistance agreements, treaties with almost 30 countries now. Of course, it depends on which country we're talking about. Some countries can provide more assistance, some less. But this is an important thing. The Ukraine Defense Contact Group, which was established by US, but now is basically operated and ran by NATO headquarters, and because they did this change last year, anticipating that new administration of Trump might, not be necessarily interested in running this structure. So here you have 50 plus countries actually taking part. So therefore there are so many tasks and priorities for Ukrainian foreign policies, but right now everything is focused on survival, on defending Ukraine, on thinking, how not to lose the peace, how first not to lose the war, but also not to lose the peace, because Ukrainians know that whatever Russia is signing, there's no value in it. They've been violating so many agreements before. There's no trust whatsoever. So no one in Ukraine just wants to sign something for the sake of signing. Some kind of ceasefire, the fragile, which would give Russia operational pause, and they would just recruit more people, mobilize more people, and produce more weapons, and would continue pushing into Ukraine. Because if you look at their rhetorics, and actually formally their priorities in Russia, they're just not comfortable with independent Ukraine standing next door to Russia. So therefore, I'm not talking about incorporating necessarily entire Ukraine into Russian Federation, but they don't want independent, viable, sovereign Ukraine. So this is what the foreign policy of Ukraine is doing, and that's what all of us are doing. We're trying to secure the future for us, which is not ideal, which is of course going to be grim anyway, and it will require more work in the coming years. But at least that would secure the existence of our nation state.
Really important. It's really important how you have brought this whole conversation back to the concept of sovereignty, something which is at the core of every foreign policy,
Absolutely.
every the idea of a nation itself. So thanks for bringing the focus back, and I feel that's really the need of the hour, to make sure that the country get its sovereignty back to itself, that was never seized in the first place. Let's move on to the topic of EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. Dr. Marina Rabinovich, in the light of the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, what mechanism do you think can be implemented to improve compliance negotiations and to ensure that there is effective implementation of agreement provision, so that the agreement is not just on paper, but there is some real robust, outcome out of this?
Yeah, so the agreement has been in force for already, let's say, 8 years. So there have been already quite some frameworks and institutional groups which meet and assess the state of implementation. And this is where they negotiate in case there is something which cannot be achieved, or Ukraine needs assistance, or something has changed, because also we need to remember that the agreement was negotiated as itself more than 10 years ago, and a lot of things have changed since then. So there is a whole architecture of how this works. But still, since Ukraine started formal accession negotiations with the EU, there is always room for improvement. And in a way, what would have been interesting is to find ways to upgrade the agreement, to open up for more exports from Ukraine, for less quotas, because initially when the war just started, the EU granted fully free access for all Ukrainian goods, which wasn't the case under the deep free and comprehensive trade agreement, because there were still some sensitive issues, especially with food products, with agricultural ones. But the EU first thought, okay, it would be possible to grant full access. Then the member states many of them were against it. Maybe someone, especially our panelists, still remember all the protests at the Polish border, farmers, and all this. Then there was a compromise, and actually still the trade is not entirely free. Plus, these trade-related concessions, they are temporary, they are being prolonged each year, so there is no certainty that such a regime would continue for a long time. What could have been done is to make this regime permanent, to integrate these changes into the cessation agreement, as well as the changes which concern road transport, which concern conformity assessment of Ukrainian goods. This has been another story with industrial goods, which started probably 6 years ago, but still the EU and Ukraine are not finished with discussing the agreement on conformity assessment, so that Ukrainian industrial goods would be considered of the same quality as the EU ones. And this is also something which can be finished if there is enough, let's say, will and enough opportunities for the EU to help navigate the interests of local industrial groups. Because what I believe is that they are afraid that there would be too many industrial products from Ukraine coming, even though many of the industrial regions are either occupied or destroyed because of the Russian invasion. However, still, there are ways for moving forward. Also, quite some ways I would find that interesting with defense tech, in a way that the EU, like Denmark does it, they invest in the Ukrainian defense facilities and then kind of lead the process, but they don't just give weapons to Ukraine, but they sponsor weapons being produced in Ukraine with the new technologies. So this is something that you could have done collectively, or the coalition of the willing could have done this, and the association agreement offers, let's say, good legal basis and legal background to do so and to not pay too many custom fees or similar things. So this is something that could have been done.
Crucial point, and thank you for highlighting the case study of Denmark here, something that we can definitely think more on. Ensuring the effective implementation of EU and Ukraine Association Agreement is indeed very vital at this time, and addressing compliance challenges will be definitely the key to its success. My last question for today is directed to Dr. Leon Hartwell. Dr. Leon, we have dedicated so much of good discussion on mediation strategies. Taking a step away from that discussion, I want to understand, beyond mediation and negotiation, what alternative pathways exist for ending this aggression of Russia on Ukraine?
Let me tell you this. I don't like saying this because I spent my entire time doing my PhD on mediation as a tool of conflict resolution. So I don't like what I'm about to say to you right now. But I think the only alternative to mediation at this particular moment in time is to dramatically increase support for Ukraine, both financially and, in terms of military support, in order to enable Ukraine to continue this war. It's not because I'm a pro-war activist or anything like that, but I think that's the only viable solution at this point in time. I think as long as Putin remains in power, his expansionist ambitions will persist. And a settlement that would reward Russia would encourage future wars. So those are important points. Now, I don't think a complete military victory by Ukraine will be possible or decisive. Those things are rare. But I do think it's important to change Putin's calculus on the battlefield. I think right now, the way I describe US and EU support for Ukraine, for example, is sort of this bangers and mash approach. We're giving enough to Ukraine to survive, but not enough to win this war or to at least change that calculus, Putin's calculus that I mentioned earlier. I think that we need to dramatically escalate support for Ukraine so that we can get Putin to the table to negotiate in good faith. So just to put things into perspective, up to now, for the past 3 years, Ukraine has received about $280 billion in aid globally. It's not what Trump said, $500 billion, which he's demanding from Ukraine, through his extortion. But Europe contributed the bulk of that aid, which amounts to about 138 billion US dollars. The US contributed 120 billion US dollars. And for perspective, what the US gave to Ukraine over a period of 3 years, is the equivalent of what the US spent in Afghanistan in 1 year. Okay, so it's not that much, the way it's been presented and politicized by some individuals. In terms of there's a lot of disparities in terms of contributions by NATO member states. So we have small states like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania that have contributed close to 2% of their GDP towards Ukraine's war efforts. That's both military and humanitarian aid, of course. But then there are major NATO economies like the US, Germany, and the UK that have contributed far less in GDP percentage terms, ranging between about 0.3% and 0.6%. So I think there's a lot of potential for increased NATO funding for Ukraine. And to contextualize things also, if you combine all the economies among NATO states, that amounts to about 46 trillion US dollars. That's 20 times larger than the Russian economy. So theoretically, it's pretty easy to outspend Russia. Russia right now contributes about 7% of its entire GDP to war efforts. Not just to the war, to its entire defense spending. So NATO can outspend Russia. And I would argue that I think if each NATO state contributed about 1% of their GDP to Ukraine, we can bring that amount of support for Ukraine to 460 billion per year, which will ensure military superiority. And I'm not ignorant, of course. It would also depend on the type of support that Ukraine receives from the West. It needs certain weapons and capabilities that it hasn't received yet, in order to win this war or to bring Putin to the table. But if you think 1% is a lot, just take into consideration that during World War II, the United States and the UK allocated 40% and 53% of their GDP, respectively, to defense spending. So 1% is not that much, especially if, as European leaders, one after the other, have argued, it's not just about Ukraine security, it's also European security at stake. And when European security is vulnerable, it also impacts transatlantic security and, I would argue, global security. Thank you.
It's really interesting how you have so beautifully summarized the concept of collective security and how each NATO state can, contribute to this, the cause. And I really appreciate the fact that every one of you today has shared so many nuanced things with us. There were so many new things that we got to know. This discussion has given us a lot to think about, ranging from economic models to geopolitical landscape, the role of international mediation efforts, political leadership, the role of governance, and most importantly, the topic of sovereignty itself. Like, we have discussed so much, and it's clear that while the road to peace is not straightforward and it's complicated, but it's still achievable. There's still things that we can do collectively to bring peace to the region. And as we have heard from our esteemed panelists today, achieving a just and lasting peace will require not only just military and economic strategies, but more nuanced than that. It requires strong alliances, institutional reforms, innovative diplomatic efforts, and effort from NATO, European Union, and also smaller countries. Everyone highlighted the role of India here as well so beautifully. So that's amazing. Well, there are no easy answers to any question that we pose here, but conversations like these always help us to critically examine the pathways forward. I would like to thank you, everyone. A huge thank to all the panel members who brought their insights and expertise into this discussion. Thank you so much for taking out time today. And I would also like to thank the audience for engaging in these critical discussion every time you feel there.